Camps, China's High Tech Penal Colony. It's a new book about the ongoing campaign of state-directed surveillance, repression, incarceration, and violence directed at Uyghurs and other members of religious and ethnic minorities in China's far western region of Xinjiang, and about the technology that facilitates and in some ways has shaped that campaign. I'm Susan Jakes. I'm the editor of ChinaFile, which is an online magazine published by Asia Society's Center on U.S.-China Relations. I'm joined tonight by my colleague, ChinaFile's senior editor, Jessica Batke, and we're both so pleased to welcome the author of In the Camps, Darren Byler. Darren is an anthropologist and expert on Xinjiang, with his first scholarly monograph coming out in just a few months. He's currently an assistant professor at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, and he's been a contributor of groundbreaking reporting and analysis for ChinaFile over the past several years. So I know I speak both for myself and for Jessica when I say how honored we are to be hosting the launch of his important and really devastating new book. Tonight's event is part of our ongoing series, ChinaFile Presents, and the first installment of this series that we've done online. I'd much rather have had the chance to talk with Darren and Jessica in person, but we have more than 200 of you tuning in with us tonight, and we wouldn't have had quite as much room for you if we had been in our pre-pandemic bricks and mortar setup in New York. But if this had been an in real life book launch, you'd have had a chance to buy a copy of In the Camps right after we finished talking about it. So I hope I can encourage you to do that virtually by picking your favorite independent online book purveyor. In the Camps is also available on Audible and elsewhere as an audiobook. Anyway, we'll try to remind you of that when we wrap up tonight. We are broadcasting this talk across a number of platforms, but if you're here as a registered participant in the Zoom webinar, you can send questions for our panelists using the Q&A feature. Send those anytime, and Jessica, Darren, and I will talk for around 45 minutes, and then I'll begin to take your questions. So Darren, the subject of your book is not only the network of detention facilities, camps across Xinjiang, where beginning around 2017, more than 1 million Uyghurs and members of other minority groups have been forcibly detained in appallingly inhumane conditions, but also about the broader systems of control and intimidation that make the whole region into a kind of open air prison. And I think, given how difficult it is to grasp the extremity of what's taking place in Xinjiang, one of the things that makes your book so powerful is the way it weaves together the factual and theoretical underpinnings of this larger system with the stories of individual people, ex-detainees, and some of the people who detained them, who are now outside of China and who have spoken to you in great detail about what they went through. I'd like to focus on these individual stories, but first maybe just sketch out for us how and why did this campaign begin so that we have our bearings a bit.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for hosting me here. It's a real honor. And this book has been in a long process. I started 10 years ago doing research in this region, and then I've spent the last several years really thinking about this book and how to present it. And really the origins of what's happened to the people that were detained is, you have to go back to around 2014, which is when the People's War on Terror was declared. That was in response to violent incidents that happened in the Uyghur region, but in other parts of China as well. Incidents where Uyghur civilians attacked Han civilians in public spaces, like a train station in Kunming and Tiananmen Square, the center of political power in China. Those incidents really, I think, set off a number of alarms across the country, both among the general public and the party elite. And that's when they really began this campaign of assessing the population and initially detaining community leaders, people that have been teaching Islam in Uyghur villages. There was a lot of thinking that if people are religious in their practice, that they're practicing in a way that's public and that is really conforming to normative forms of Islam in other places, where they're praying 5 times a day, fasting during Ramadan, those sorts of things, that could lead to terrorism. They called that kind of behavior extremism. So it was this conflation between religious behavior and violent action that led eventually to this mass internment of so many people. But it took some time for them to really, be able to assess who is doing this extremist stuff, who is fasting, who is praying 5 times a day or praying in their own homes, which is also, according to these new regulations, something that's now forbidden. And the way that they did that assessment was through a lot of human intelligence. They hired lots of people, but they also developed new technological assessment tools that could go through people's digital history and see what they've been doing online, what they've been doing on social media, and where they had been traveling, what their social network looked like, if they had relatives living abroad in places like Turkey or Egypt. And so it took some time for them to really, turn up the pressure and then actually begin to detain people at the level of the population. And so that, didn't really arrive until 2017. When I was thinking about this and thinking about the People's War on Terror, I didn't anticipate that there would be mass detentions at this scale. And they might not have either. They might not have known that they would actually detect so many people that were, according to these new counterterrorism laws, which were implemented, so many people should be detained as having committed terrorism and extremism crimes that are not serious, but could lead to something more. And the not serious is actually how they describe these crimes.
I mean, the phenomenon of counterterrorism has a pretty checkered history, not only in China, but also around the world and right here in the US. Jessica, you have been also following events in Xinjiang quite closely, both during your years in government and in the years since you've come to ChinaFile. How do you understand how the Chinese leadership's conception of and practice of counterterrorism differs from that of other countries?
Sorry, I was forcing me to stay muted. That's a really good question. And I should preface by saying I'm not an expert in counterterrorism elsewhere. So I don't want anything I say to be construed as making counterterrorism here sound too sunny or fair, because I don't necessarily think that's true. But I think one of the key things is what Darren mentioned, which is this idea of not serious activities which are very normal parts of everyday practice, being conflated with pre-crime, as I think Darren calls it in his book, right, or pre-terrorism. And that obviously can happen elsewhere as well, but it is so, in this case, tied to specific ethnicities of people. And to people who have been in this place, like this is their homeland, right? This is where this culture has developed. And so there is a government which has come in and said, I know you've been doing this for a really long time, but now we've decided that this is terrorism. I don't want to say that's never happened anywhere else, but just from my rough understanding of what's going on in the US, that strikes me as slightly different.
Darren, anything you want to add to that? What about the scale?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. What Jessica's pointing out is that ethnicity is an important sort of variable in this system, because there is other Muslims in China that were not targeted in the same way. Uyghurs and maybe to some extent Kazakhs were seen as less assimilated, and that really has to do with their ethnicity, their racial difference, and also their language practice. So they speak Kazakh or Uyghur as their first language, and they have attachments to the lands in which they live as their ancestral homelands. So, all of that means that they're seen as more of a threat to sort of social stability, to the state. The other thing, like you mentioned, is the scale is quite different. So in the US and in Europe, there's programs called Countering Violent Extremism or Prevent in the UK, which is meant to stop people from being radicalized. And this really sort of rose to the fore, in the 2010s. And in response to things like the Islamic State, where people wanted to prevent young Muslims from being radicalized. And so they mobilized imams and other community leaders, and also school teachers and others, to report on suspicious activities that they saw in the Muslim community. The policing theory literature that I've read from China says that they think that they're doing something similar, that they're preventing Uyghurs from being radicalized by sort of nipping it in the bud. That's the term that they use. The problems are that they're using these technology tools that have been developed not from within the community, but by computer scientists, by people that are looking for markers, and are very broad. And in addition, the human technicians, the people that are employing these systems, at least in positions of power, are not from the community. And so I think they don't really understand what they're looking at, in terms of what is actually radical or not. So it's these factors combined, the ethnic difference, language difference, not really understanding what you're looking at, and then projecting it onto this entire population, that makes the scale of it so much larger, and really produces something that's more about transforming the entire population rather than targeting people that we think are suspicious.
One phrase that you use a lot in that context of this just very broad targeting, and that appears often in the book, and I think is particularly hard to grasp in the abstract, is the term digital enclosure. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that term, and maybe in the context of one of the central figures in the book, a young University of Washington student who's you came to know and whose story you tell.
Sure. So the term digital enclosure is not my own. It comes from a communication scholar named Mark Andreevich. And what he's talking about is the way all of us are in digital enclosures at this point. If we own a smartphone, or even if we don't, when we move through the world, we're being tracked in some ways. And so, most of this is by technology platforms like Facebook or whatever apps you have on your phone, or your internet provider, or it's by the state as you travel through space, like your car will be detected and so on. So in that sense, social behavior itself has been captured and is enclosed. The enclosure that Mark Andreevich is talking about is the way that things that previously were outside of the market, that were outside of governance in some ways, that were the commons of our lives, the private spaces of our lives, our social relations, those things have now become data that can be fed into the technology systems and governance systems. In Xinjiang, that is amplified to an extreme degree. They're using social media data. They're collecting GPS tracking information as people move through space on their phones, in their cars, all of that. But they've also now built out a grid network of checkpoints throughout the entire region. And so as people move through space, they encounter these checkpoints. And Vera Zhou, who's this University of Washington student, spent quite a lot of time with her and her mother over the last several years. So I was at the University of Washington teaching when she was taken. What she told me after she was able to come back is that there were moments after she had been released from the camp and was being sort of on probation, sort of under house arrest. As she would walk through space, she would encounter police officers who would pull her to the side and then take her into a surveillance hub and say, "You've been flagged by the system." And she would see her face on the screen with a square around it. there was an indication that she wasn't, so there's green squares and there's orange squares and there's red squares. It depends a bit on which system is being used. But in this case, she had an orange square, I think, around her face that indicated that she was someone who was on the watch list, on a watch list. And so she wasn't supposed to be in the area where she was. It was outside of the grid that was allotted to her. So in that sense, the digital enclosure now begins to work as a kind of controlling device that prevents people from moving through space, but only certain people. And so there's a sort of digital apartheid system where some people who are on the green list are able to walk freely, whereas the people on these watch lists are pulled to the side. And this is happening just through facial recognition. Then, of course, there's these hard checkpoints where you have your face scanned and your ID scanned and all of that. And Vera, because she's Hui and could pass as Han, would sometimes just go through the back gate or the green lane of the checkpoint and pretend to be Han rather than knowing that she's Muslim and should have her ID checked. And so that works sometimes, but not always. And so over time, she just started to say, I should stay home. I shouldn't connect with anyone on WeChat or in other ways because they could be implicated through their association with me. And so it really began to constrain her social relations. She said the main thing she did in terms of her digital self was just retweet or repost the things that her probation officer, the person who works in the civil affairs ministry who was assigned to her, what that person posted on their WeChat wall, she just amplified it to show that she was loyal and that she was committed to her rehabilitation, her transformation through this re-education regime.
One of the parts of the book that was so striking was the story of what happened to her before the period that you're talking about, when she was detained and brought to a re-education facility. And one of the things that struck me so forcefully when I was reading the book, and this is really a question for both of you, so I'll let both of you respond, is just how brutally cruel, psychologically and physically violent the re-education centers were, from the descriptions of the former detainees that you spoke to. Several of them, I can't remember if Vera was one of these, described unremitting forms of physical torture, affecting people who had been locked up for nothing more than using a VPN or watching a Turkish television show or traveling abroad, and then found themselves packed into tiny cells with dozens of other people, in some cases no toilets, just open buckets of sewage. The lights are on all the time. They're made to watch one another as they sleep, even as the guards are watching them through surveillance cameras in their cells. They describe not being able to move for long stretches of time, to the point where they begin to experience serious medical consequences, intestinal prolapse, and just horrific bodily harm. They're rarely allowed to shower. Women are drugged to stop them from menstruating. People are beaten for moving, for whispering to one another, for crying. They're severely undernourished. In some cases, they're actively tortured using machines designed for that torture. And one of your sources describes, hearing the sounds of that as she was taking her break from teaching in one of these centers every day. It's just so punitive. And yet Chinese leaders, both internally and externally, describe what's taking place as a form of de-radicalization. As you said, they often speak of it using the language of public health. They're, curing or immunizing against a diseased ideology. And I just realized I really struggle to understand how these two pieces fit together. Like, why not either let the people leave the country, or on the flip side, if they're seen as so dangerous and so criminal as to merit this kind of abuse, why not just the punishment? Why also the education? How do you understand that? Jessica, Darren.
Darren, you should go first.
Okay. Well, I mean, one of the things that Gulzira, Kalbanur Siddiq, the camp worker that you mentioned, what she's talking about is the way that people that were in management of the camp told her that, like, this is not a hotel, this is a camp. That they were very clear that there should be overcrowding, that people should be in physical discomfort and pain. That was part of the goal of sort of breaking their spirit, forcing them to submit. In some ways, I think maybe when from a central management level or position, they maybe were surprised at how many people they detained initially. And most people were held initially in sort of warehouses and government offices that were not designed to hold people at all, which is why there's buckets being used as toilets, and showers are just a once a week or once a month or what have you. Over time, I think conditions did get somewhat better in terms of sanitation and things like that. Another element of this, and we hear this in relation to sexual violence in some camps, is that some things were being done off camera, which means that the guards and management that are in the camp, are doing things to these detainees that aren't mandated. I mean, if they're doing it off camera, there's a reason for that. Some of it might have been because they were in some cases taking money, or it seems, from visitors who wanted to have sex with these women in the camp. But in other cases, they also talk about trying to hide the bruising by hitting them in the head, and because the bruises won't show through their hair, and that sort of that indicates that there's some disconnect, I think, between the local brutality inside a camp and management higher up the chain. At the same time, a camp itself is outside the law. It's outside of sort of moral, outside of legal control, and so it rests instead on the moral authority of the people that are running the camp. Their moral authority and capacity, their moral compass. And when people have absolute power in that kind of system, things often tend in this direction, I think. And there's incentives, I think, to show your cruelty, especially for Uyghur and Kazakh guards, because they need to show how loyal they are. What do you think, Jessica? Is that what do you think?
I agree with all of that. I think it's also important to think about what are the long-term goals of this campaign, right? And part of that is to stop generational cultural transmission, to get people to control their own behavior, or maybe even for younger people to not even think in the extremist ways that previous generations had, right? And the goal is not necessarily to keep everyone locked up forever. It is to instill absolute fear and loyalty so that people will behave themselves. And this is abetted by the fact that they never know when they're being watched and when they're not being watched, right? Like, you will always behave if you think that any point in your day, no matter where you are, you could be monitored. I thought one of the vignettes that struck me so forcefully from the book was when someone was coming, they were finally allowed to see their family member who was in a camp, and the family members had to say they knew that everything was okay, like they were all good, and they knew that the person in the camp was being treated well, and the person in the camp had to say, yes, they're treating me well and everything's good. And the family knew that was false. The detainee knew that was false. The guard who was watching this and who told the detainee to say that also knew it was false. And I couldn't think of a reason for this bizarre play acting where everyone knows a thing is false and we all have to say it out loud anyway, other than instilling the absolute bodily absolute loyalty to the state or absolute obedience to the state. I couldn't come up with another reason because I just thought it was so bizarre. But I wanted to ask a question, Susie, if I can.
It's not bizarre in the context of authoritarian political systems,
sure,
right?
yeah,
that
it was a striking, where everyone involved, all sides of it knew it's not real. But yes, I guess it's not bizarre in that way. If I can ask a question.
Yeah, of course.
This kind of goes back to some of the things you were talking about earlier, Darren, but also, you mentioned you think they were surprised at the beginning about how many people they detained. And I'm also just wondering about the criteria that they're using for detaining people, right? We've talked a lot about those and how overly broad and arbitrary they are. And I'm just wondering, if you can talk a little bit about how that arbitrariness can be masked at times by the use of technology, right? If it's this very fancy machine with all this data says this person is an extremist and therefore we must arrest them. And it can mask a lot of the fact that there's a human on the back end of that, setting what the sliders are for what gets set. You talk a lot about that in the book, and I think that's a really important point. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more how that, I don't know if that played into how many people were initially detained that they were surprised by, or just any thoughts you have.
Yeah, I mean, once the system is set in motion, and there are so many incentives to detain as many people as possible in order to sort of prove your loyalty or your commitment to the campaign, at the local level, proving to people higher in command. That's, I think, when you really get these really immense numbers. And technology is used to assist that, for sure. So some of the former detainees I spoke with said they still don't know why they were detained, and no one could tell them why they were detained. They said, you know why you're detained. You wouldn't be here if you weren't supposed to be. And there's also, in interrogation, I heard from numerous former detainees, an incentive to profess your guilt, even if you aren't guilty of the thing they say you are, because if you say you're innocent, you're not portraying a good attitude, which means that you'll be beaten more harshly. The guilt is sort of presumed as soon as the person is deemed untrustworthy. It's very difficult, I found, in most cases, for people to get off the list if they've been determined to be untrustworthy. Only in the beginning, if you had some government connections or some potentially money, you could get out of it. But in general, that wasn't the case. So I think the authority of the technology really determined at least that initial investigation. And then almost in all cases, the investigation, comes back with a verdict of guilty. One of the things that people are also up against is being sent to prison instead of the camp. And so there's sort of a plea bargaining that's happening where, camp is seen as a lesser charge. And it is, you'll get out more quickly. And so, people, I think, are willing to accept whatever the police are telling them they've been guilty of pretty readily. They really have no choice.
You cite the statistic that something like 500,000 people were also criminally prosecuted in Xinjiang between, I think, 2017 and 2020, and that's a rate of criminal prosecution that's many times, is it six times higher than the national average. Do we have any sense of what those cases look like? Are they available? Who was getting prosecuted that way, and where are all those people in prison, or did some of them also wind up in these camps?
So many of those people were initially in the camps, and then after they were there for a year or more, were then criminally prosecuted. That's my sense of it. Although we know that something like 200,000 or so people were sentenced in the first 2 years of the campaign, 2017 and 18. And then after that, they stopped actually listing. By 2019, they stopped listing the sentencing data, but they still include the numbers prosecuted. And if someone is prosecuted formally in China, there's a 99% of being convicted. So we have a pretty good sense that those 533,000 people that were prosecuted were found guilty. And we don't know for sure that all of them were associated only with the re-education camps or were Muslims, but still it gives us a sense of just rates of prosecution. many of the people that were sent to prison were people that were, I think, deemed still untrustworthy, not re-educated. Maybe they didn't pass language and ideology exams. In some cases, it may have been that they were not deemed sort of a good fit for labor, because many of the former detainees have been sent to work in factories. It could be that they're seen as more tightly connected to extremism and those sorts of things, and so it's more difficult for them to be rehabilitated. But we've seen cases of entire families that have been sentenced, for having a relative that, or it appears, for having a relative living in Turkey, for giving money to those relatives living in Turkey, which is said to be supporting terrorism, those sorts of things. Many religious leaders in these communities have also been sentenced. Those are the kinds of people we see being sentenced. Those that were whose crimes were, I think, more serious. Part of what's happening here is it's just so difficult to prosecute everyone when you've detained so many people all at the same time. The prosecutors were just overloaded, and so I think that's maybe why it took so much time to move them from the camps and detention centers into prisons. And they had to build the prisons too. So
you touched on this just briefly, but maybe you could talk a little bit about how coerced labor fits into this picture that you're painting for us. Who benefits from it? I mean, we know the Chinese Communist Party has a long tradition of reform through labor, and that the PRC has a long history both of this idea that a person's beliefs can be beneficially altered through hard labor, and about an equally long history of the forced labor of prisoners benefiting the state in various ways, or cronies of the state in material ways. Is this just more of that same pattern, or is there a different dynamic at play with the use of incarcerated or detained people in forced labor?
So, in 2018, the Economic Development Affairs Commission, I'm butchering the name, but that's something like that, of the Uyghur region, said that the camps had become a carrier of the economy because they were attracting so many new companies from other parts of China. Many of these companies came as part of pairing assistance programs. Localities across Eastern China have sort of adopted counties or cities in Xinjiang as their sister city or sister county, and they've developed factories and industrial parks associated with them. So there's some indication that there's this mechanism that's built into the camps and the factories where there's kind of a pipeline from the camps to the factories. There's subsidies for the companies to relocate. And there's assurances that the workers will be compliant. They're told, at least in some cases, very directly, that if they don't work as they're told, they'll be sent back to the camp. So there's that dynamic that's in play. In some cases, the camps and the factories are in the same location. In other cases, they're nearby. So, that's one track of labor. There's another track of labor that's going on at the same time, which is turning farmers and herders into factory workers, people that were not ever detained in the camps, but were deemed surplus laborers because they don't have an employer and didn't have a substantial enough income and are of certain age. And those people are also graded, and there's an actual point system that they use to decide who is a secure laborer, and that those laborers can be sent to Eastern China, and who is a sort of normal labor. Those are sent to factories that are in the Xinjiang region, and then there's the untrustworthy laborers who are sent to training. And one track of training is the camps. So really, what we're seeing is a sort of population-wide proletarianization, which is like a Marxist term for for turning people that are doing agricultural work or non-industrial work into industrial workers and really integrating them into the wage economy, which is the Chinese marketplace. And so I think, removing people from the land and placing them in the factory is another way of sort of instilling a form of power and control over the population, and also a sort of forcible integration. So that seems to be one of the things that is motivating this.
Do you want to add anything, Jessica? Couldn't see if you were.
No, I don't need to add anything. I'm good.
In that case, Darren, I realized that I have another question a little bit unrelated to the book. It occurs to me that, I've known you for several years. I don't know much about how you embarked on your relationship with Xinjiang as a scholar. I'm sure a book like the one that you've just written probably wasn't what you had in mind at the time, but I'd love to just hear a little bit about how you came to Xinjiang.
Well, it was a long time ago. I went there for the first time in 2003 when I was an undergraduate student. I had been studying photojournalism and was really interested in seeing the world. I grew up in Ohio, which seems about as far away from Xinjiang as you can get. And that was my goal, really, to kind of get as far away as I could from the places I had grown up in. And as a photographer, Xinjiang was a place that was really interesting in terms of sort of social life that happens in public. This vibrant bazaar culture, landscapes, and these vernacular cities that have been built over centuries. The architecture is the vernacular part of it. It's built in the style of courtyard houses with little winding alleyways and things like that. So initially that's what drew me to it, is like, this place seems really interesting, very different from what I understood, and I was also really interested in the way that these traders and craftspeople in this space were carrying forward traditions that seemed really old in some ways. They were still making a lot of things by hand. So it seemed like an intact culture in some ways. And eventually I became an anthropologist, and that interest in culture and how humans sustain themselves, how they bring indigenous or local traditions into the present. That's really what first attracted me to the Uyghurs. I could see also at the same time as I was seeing all of that, maybe not initially, but over time, that the Open Up the West campaign, which was China's development initiative that would go into Northwest China, that was going to radically transform this space. I could see already infrastructure being built, railroads and development in the space. And so, as I developed my project, it became about how this space is being transformed by this new economic presence of people that were moving in, and all of this new development of the resources. I didn't anticipate, that there would be camps in that story. Initially, I was interested in the digital infrastructure that was being built and how that was transforming Uyghur life. The WeChat allowed them to connect with each other, find jobs, move to the city, and connect with the broader world. But then over time, it became a story about surveillance and how that digital activity would be used to put these people in camps.
Talk a little bit about your last couple of research trips to Xinjiang. I mean, you must have had a lot of people as an anthropologist that you got to know really well through your field work and friends. And what has it been like doing research maybe over the past? Well, you picked the period, but I guess you were last there in 2018. Is that right?
That's right. So I did most of my field work in 2014 and 15, which is when the People's War on Terror began. And so most of my relationships were built then. And I was mostly spending time with Uyghur male migrants to the city. So I had, all of these friends from across the region who had moved to Urumqi. And initially that's, what I was studying is how they survive in the city, how they protect themselves, and how the police and other forces in the city tries to control them. So that was a central tension in the initial research. In 2018, when I came back, I really couldn't connect with those people because many of them had been taken to the camps. Not, I don't think necessarily because of their contact with me several years before, but because they had, they had been involved in religious activities. Most of my contacts back in 2014 and 15 were going to the mosque, were using WeChat to talk about the Quran and things like that. All these things that would later be outlawed. So in 2018, I couldn't really contact them. Instead, I really went to these checkpoints and observed what happens in the checkpoints. I tried to travel in ways where the migrants that I'd known would have traveled, which was mostly the buses, because a lot of the controls are happening in those spaces rather than in airplanes or in other more sort of affluent ways of traveling. So, I was observing all of these checkpoints, the grid system. They had hired, or were in the process of hiring, 60,000 new grid workers and tens of thousands more police. And so I was stopped often by these grid workers, asked for my documents, and had some conversations with them. So, all of that gave me a
grid
feeling
is a
for
policing system, right? Not an electricity carrying system as we would think of it.
That's right. Yeah. The grid is a policing grid, and there's convenience police stations, which is how they're called, people's convenience police stations, every 200 to 300 meters. And these grid workers, which are these low-level police, assistant police is what they're called. They're the ones that conduct the checks around those surveillance hubs and also these physical checkpoints. So that's what I was looking for, was how does this grid system work? Then in 2020, I went to Kazakhstan and interviewed around 40 people, most of whom had come across the border recently. And there's maybe 15 or so detainees that I interviewed at that time, former detainees. And those stories really became the majority of the narratives that are in the book, the stories of what those people told me. But because I had spent time in the grids and seen what kind of life they had been through, I could ask them very specific questions about the things I had observed in the years before. So I think that brings a different level of detail to the stories that the former detainees could tell me. The other thing I should mention is I've also been looking at tens of thousands of internal police documents that were obtained by The Intercept that are very granular and level, in terms of the detail. And it's reports written by these grid workers, the low-level police, and also the civil affairs ministry people that decide who should go to the camps. So that, also figures into how I understand the sort of physics of the system. And of course, I've been working with Jessica on the surveillance documents that she's gotten too, which are amazing in terms of showing the capacities of the systems.
I'm going to jump in with a question. This is a little bit afield from what Susie just asked, but it's something that really struck me that seemed to appear in multiple places implicitly in the book, was this idea of the partial invisibility of the Uyghur or other ethnic minorities' experiences in terms of from the Han majority perspective, right? So, there's a couple places where, you mentioned that, for example, when Vera was when she was being put into a police car, she had a Han boyfriend. And so she was treated much better when he could see. And then once he couldn't see her anymore, how they actually physically treated her changed. And there's quotes from people who were from people who are saying, well, there's a lot of Han migrants who didn't really know anything. So they figured there must be terrorists everywhere if they're detaining all these people, right? And at the same time, there's instances you're just describing, I think there was someone on a bus and there was young Han teenagers that were yelling at them, why are you here? Why haven't you been sent away yet? So there's still, there's this tension of a partial invisibility of this experience. And also, that some Han people still have the power, even though they can't see everything, to send these people away. I'm just wondering how you assess, how some of these Han people living in Xinjiang like view what's going on and how that does or doesn't affect the policies that are happening in China?
I think a lot of Han people have a very partial view of the camp system, and it's really sort of limited to their own experience. Many have been assigned to work as relatives or to go and visit, adopt a Uyghur or Kazakh family and live in their home and then write reports about what they see. And that's seen as like a real inconvenience. But I don't know that many of them fully understand what their reports will do to those people, what the camp conditions are really like. It's hard to know for sure because sometimes when I talked to people in 2018, I interviewed a number of those people. They would give me a range of views. Like someone would say that, oh, it is kind of a school. Of course, they're being punished, but it is sort of a school. Then others would say it's going to be really difficult because they've been torn apart from their families and stuff. So they acknowledged those aspects of it, but I don't know if they knew exactly how horrific conditions in the camp were. That these people are shackled and have hoods put over their heads and are treated in really inhumane ways. Of course, there's many people that actually work in the camps and I think have a very full view of what's going on. But it's hard to know, how that breaks down across the entire population. The people that actually live in the region, that are from that region, the people that see themselves as local to Xinjiang, and Uyghur food is really their food. Those people, Han people, they see what's happening as something that's I think a pretty dramatic overreach, because I think they understand that Uyghurs are not terrorists in general. They've lived with them for decades and it's been fine. So I think there is sort of that knowledge gap when it comes to, how long has that person been in the region? Who do they know? What have they seen? There's so much gaslighting in the media that I think it's really hard for people to know, what they're hearing from Chinese state media. What is the truth about this system?
That's a nice lead into another question that I had for both of you, and it looks like actually somebody from the audience had the same question. So good audience. The Associated Press just published a story, I think yesterday, reporting that some of the most visible signs of control in Xinjiang, particularly the technological ones, have disappeared from the streets of Xinjiang's larger cities. The surveillance cameras are being taken down. Of course, China's government announced at the end of 2019 that everyone who needed re-education had already been fully re-educated, and that the camps were closed. Obviously, these two pieces of information come from very, very different kinds of sources. A very good Associated Press reporter on the one hand, and maybe a slightly more unreliable narrative on the other side. But the reporter Dick Kang writes that the panic that had gripped the region a few years ago has subsided considerably, and that there's a sense of normality creeping back in. I want to ask both of you, what do you make of this? How do you understand what is happening now? Jessica, you want to start? And then
I was going to let Darren start because it's his book. Go ahead,
Okay.
Darren.
All right. Well, I've talked to Dake, the author of that Associated Press piece, many times, including after his recent trip. And during that same trip, he went to what is now called the number 3 jail, Kanshousuo, which is in Dabancheng. It's the largest camp that there was. And what he saw there was that just basically the name had been changed from camp or re-education center to jail. And he went inside and saw the cells that in the past were the camp cells and are now jail cells. So really what's happening is a shift, I think, from internment to imprisonment. So there's a sort of warehousing of these people that formerly were in the camps and maybe had some potential of being released. and are now being held inside the prisons. And Dake would say this too, that the surveillance equipment that's being taken down is in urban areas and is in places where international visitors travel more frequently. And so I think, if it's intentionally being taken down, which we see like cameras being ripped out of the wall, basically, or off the poles with the wire still there, that I think is, because there's some narrative control that the state is really wanting to do. In other parts of Xinjiang, especially northern Xinjiang, there's also now checkpoints that are no longer really being used, where the equipment isn't really functional. And it seems as though that's because both there's not funding to keep it functional, and also there's not political will. They don't really see the urgency in having those checkpoints there anymore. So it's hard to know exactly what is motivating these changes. I think international pressure is a major factor, though, and shouldn't be discounted. Part of it, I think, is that maybe they feel like the systems have accomplished what they wanted them to do, which is terrify the entire population, and transform them to put them to work in these factories without any forms of resistance. Does that sound right to you, Jessica?
Yeah, I really worry that some of this dismantling that we're seeing, or the outward signs of a return to normalcy, are manifestations of the fact that the government thinks it's successfully executed parts of this campaign, right? And the important part is that even when people are out, they're not in camps, they're out on the street, they are still being watched. Even if those cameras have been ripped off the poles, everybody carries a tracking device with them all the time, right? And people can be questioned, why don't you have a smartphone, right? So there are still ways of monitoring people. Everyone knows that. People are still, Uyghurs in the diaspora are still cut off from their family members. Even if their family members are out of the camps, they're not talking to them. So, my concern is that this outward sign of normality can help mask the fact that a lot of these people are still really unfree in important ways. And yeah, it's quite canny if you're the Chinese government.
Mm-hmm.
So do you see this as, how do you understand how China's leaders see the end game of this process? What is it gonna, the 1.5 million people, and if you include the 500,000 kids that are in, are in, what do you call them? Jail, orphanages, but children who have been separated from their parents. You're talking about roughly or more than 10% of the whole ethnic minority population of Xinjiang, right? Or is the expectation that this is just something that has now reached a stage where it can continue? Do you think it's reached a kind of a stasis, or what might we expect next? I realize that's a hard question.
Yeah, what the government says that they're doing is that they're attempting to create long-term stability, that it's a solution to the Xinjiang problem, and so that they need to have firm resolve in accomplishing this mission. And I don't know exactly what that means. It's quite vague, but I think in general, it means that this is a long process that should be thought of as like at a generational scale. And so I think they really feel like the children who are in these residential boarding schools, and there's a whole range of them, from kindness centers for the children, the toddlers, to formal schools. They've hired 90,000 new teachers who are politically loyal, many from outside of the Uyghur region, who are non-Muslims, to teach in these schools. I think they feel like that educational aspect of it, the residential schools, that is really what will produce a new generation of Uyghurs and Kazakhs who will have a lot less loyalty to their identity, who will perhaps see their identity as lacking in some ways. Of course, we know from other sort of colonial experiments that residential schools don't often accomplish what they are intended to do, and instead they traumatize entire populations. And so I think what we'll see going forward is, trauma playing out throughout the entire population of of Uyghur society and Kazakh society. The factory separation aspects of this system, where they're sending farmers and herders to other parts of China, other parts of Xinjiang, separating them from their children. That's a process of fragmenting the basic social units, the families themselves, which is the source of social reproduction, the future of the society. And so I think that's, in the long term, along with the family planning rules and all of that, is really what's going to diminish the vitality of Uyghur and Kazakh society going forward.
Yeah, I completely agree that this is something that I think the leadership is thinking about in generational terms. And the goal is not to stop, say, Uyghurs from being, it's to stop Uyghurs from being Uyghur in all the ways that the Chinese government has determined that to be problematic. And, while these boarding schools are absolutely going to traumatize people, and everything that's happening right now is going to traumatize people, they are keeping these children from speaking Uyghur, right? A lot of these kids may grow up not being able to speak it. I mean, there are ways that they're managing to cut off that cultural transmission through this. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know where we go next from here, but I do think it's a generational time scale where they're working on.
Maybe just one more question from me, and then we can start taking some from the audience. But I just wanted to turn to the final section of the book, Darren, where you write at length about the role of technology, AI, many kinds of technology developed outside of China for, if not perfectly benign, then at least far less overtly abusive purposes than the ones that they're being used for in Xinjiang, that are then fairly easily transmuted into instruments of repression in the context of Xinjiang. Some of the same kinds of biometric scanning devices and software being used to combat COVID have had far more sinister applications in Xinjiang. And so I wonder, in ending the book that way, do you see this as a cautionary tale about technology per se, or more about something else, the dangers of letting it fall into the wrong hands? Or explain your view of these technologies.
I mean, some of what I was doing was thinking in terms of the narrative of the book. I start in Seattle with Vera Jo coming from the University of Washington, and I end in Seattle with companies that are coming from Seattle and back to China. And that there's, a central player, which is the University of Washington in that story, and also Microsoft and others. So that was sort of what I was thinking. It's supposed to be about a global issue, and I wanted to draw out those connections. I think this is a story about technology and about the role of surveillance in the world. In the West, we're in the digital enclosure as well. We've mostly consented to be in it by saying yes to Facebook and Twitter and all the other apps we have on our phones. And so as a consumer, and as someone who is protected in terms of our citizenship status, for most of us, that's maybe concerning that our phones know so much about us, these companies know so much about us, but it's a choice that we've made, and our situation is not dire. For people that are in less protected situations, like the Uyghurs, for instance, and other stateless populations, so just asylum seekers at the southern border of the US are also in a similar sort of position where their social media can be used against them to track their social network and control them. For them, it's not just a choice. it's about, the future of their lives themselves. And so I think, we should think about the moral implications of building such tools that have this differential effect on people that are less protected. And what I'd like to see technologists, and people thinking about ethics and politics, advocate a bit more forcefully is, tools that are designed in a way that protect the people that are most vulnerable. So that's what I hope people get out of the book. The other thing I want to point out is just how normal these technologies are, that we use them all the time, or we've experienced them in many ways. When you go through the customs at the airport, like, you have your face scanned, you have your biometrics taken, all of the same tools that are being used dozens of times a day in Xinjiang. The difference is really the scale and the protections of the people that are being assessed by those tools. So part of the issue is not only the technology, but also the laws. And so another indictment that's in the book, buried in there, is thinking about terrorism and counterterrorism, and who counts as a terrorist, and how there's a racialized aspect to that discourse that comes out of the West and has now been adapted by China.
So I'm just looking at some of the questions that are coming in from the audience. And again, if you are a registered participant in this webinar, you should feel free to use the Q&A function to send us some questions. There's several of the questions relate to policy responses to what's taking place in Xinjiang, policy responses in the United States, and some of them asked specifically about genocide. I had meant to ask you about this myself. President Biden, during the summer before he was elected, described what was taking place in Xinjiang as a genocide. Shortly after, the Trump administration, made that same designation, which has now been adopted by the Biden administration. Throughout the book, you draw certain analogies, particularly in the sections where you are discussing the dehumanizing aspects of the detention camps. You draw analogies to the Holocaust. I don't think you use the word genocide, and I wondered a bit about that, and how you see this designation working as a policy tool just as an accurate description of what's happening on the one hand, and then also as a tool for trying to organize political action.
Well, I'm not a legal expert or a policy expert per se. I do have some opinions. A lot of the thinking I'm doing in relation to the Holocaust, or writing about the Holocaust, is, I draw on the work of Primo Levi, and Hannah Arendt is in the back of my mind a lot as well. Is really thinking about the mechanisms inside the camps, how dehumanizing work happens, how power relations are built by turning detainees against each other, and guards enforcing rules in particular ways. So camps in general do those sorts of things because they're outside of legal frameworks. When it comes to genocide, I think it does meet the definition, at least one of the definitions of genocide, which is having to do with the transfer of children from one ethnic group to another. There does appear to be an intent to destroy a people or aspects of a people's way of life. Most people, when they think about genocide, think about mass killing, and we haven't seen evidence of mass killing or intentional killing. There are certainly deaths in the camps and in the prisons, mostly though from neglect, from abuse, from torture, those sorts of things, not lining people up and killing them en masse. So, I think there is some use value for sure in terms of political pressure and leverage when you have a genocide designation. I think crimes against humanity is certainly meets all criteria for that. That's a little less workable probably when it comes to legal frameworks. So, that's kind of where I come down on this issue. One of the main factors here is that China is a very powerful actor in the world, and so building coalitions in opposition to it are very difficult. And so that's really where I think the most work needs to be done, is in that coalition building and really being resolved around this issue. I don't know if Jessica has thoughts on this or not.
Yeah, I'm similarly, not a lawyer or international criminal law expert, so I don't want to wade too deeply into some ill-informed opinion about what label is correct. I think for me, when I'm thinking about this, it's always it's so clear that what is happening is horrific in every aspect and needs to be stopped, right? So the question that I'm always asking myself is, what is the term that best accommodates that reality, right? What is the term that is going to get people to raise people's awareness, to get people activated, to think about this in the most productive way? And the problem, with the world in general right now is how polarized almost every conversation it feels like we have has become, right? And so I think it's a useful term if it gets people activated and can, as Darren was saying, help build international coalitions and do things like that. I am concerned that if some people can take it as just being purely political and use it kind of in the opposite way and say, well, this is just the U.S. wanting to bludgeon China, because it's anti-China, and so. I'm constantly having this war with myself about those terms. But for me, it really just comes down to, this is truly, truly horrific, and whatever gets the job done, gets the job done.
Another audience member is asking, I think this one's for you, Darren, how you assess the UN's response to the evidence of what has taken place in Xinjiang.
Well, it's been slow. I think that's clear. And part of that has to do with the previous US administration's withdrawal from the UN Human Rights Council. Although the UN has also really held them to held China to task when it comes to certain commissions within the human rights, the UN, not human rights, but having to do with race and other issues. So it's, I guess, been a mixed response. But the UN is a body that has many voting members, and China is quite powerful at the UN. And so there's sort of a block of support that has formed around China's position, mostly having to do, I think, with trade relations with China and maintaining good relations with China, less about the evidence on the ground. So there's more work to be done at the UN for sure. And that's one space where there could be more coalition building. I have been encouraged with some of the research that is being done sort of behind the scenes at the UN that I've been involved with personally. I think there are people there that are very concerned. So we'll see how it plays out over time.
Susie, you're muted.
I am sorry about that. I'm just looking through some of these great questions from the audience, some of which I think are just asking for you to elaborate a bit more on some of the things that you've already said, Darren. But one question is asking you to go into a bit more detail about the official Chinese explanation for what's going on in Xinjiang, including how many people they claim are being interrogated and detained, for what reasons, and what the trend is in terms of the future of the camps. I know you've talked about that a little bit, but maybe just give us a sense of, where those statements have been over the last year or so.
Well, the Chinese state has not given a number officially of the people that are detained. They have agreed that there are education centers. Those names have changed over time as well. So I can't give you the state, statistics, because they haven't provided them. What they have said, and this is in a document that they've given to the UN in response to, and I'm blanking on the commission that's within the UN that asked for this. It had to do with racial justice.
Yeah, Commission on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination.
Right. So in response to queries from that body, they gave a report that talked about the types of people that they detained. And they said very clearly that people that have been sent to these centers are those whose terrorism and extremism crimes are not serious. That's one category. Another category are those who have committed harmful crimes, terrorism and extremism crimes, but without malicious intent. And also they had the capacity to confess and ask for forgiveness. The third group of people that were detained, they said, are people that were had been formally sentenced as criminals in the past, or at least that's the indication I had, although it might have been also that those are being sentenced in the future. So they were getting their re-education before going to prison. But there's some connection with having a formal prison sentence. So those were the types of people they said they detained, which accords with all of the documents I've seen. So in the Intercept data set that I've reviewed, I see, between 10 to 20% of adults of adult Muslims, Turkic Muslims for the most part, but Muslims in general, in particular neighborhoods in Urumqi being detained. And, in some places you see slightly higher numbers, 20% of adults being detained. In other places, you see slightly lower numbers. But in general, the sort of 10% to 15% of the adult Muslim population being detained seems pretty solid. And this is based on empirical data, government data from particular cases across the region. And so you can start there, but then when you start to talk to detainees about the people that have been detained in their situations, and interviews with people from across the region, you get the same numbers over and over again, or thereabouts, 10 to 20%. So I would say that that's a safe estimate in terms of how many people have been detained, and in most cases are still missing. Sometimes they've been sent to factories. In other cases, though, they're just now in prison.
We have, unsurprisingly, another few questions about international response, including one about the role the private sector has to play in addressing what's taking place in Xinjiang. Does large-scale international boycotting help achieve liberation for the Uyghur people? Question, I think, is a lot of people are also thinking about in the context of the upcoming Olympics.
I'll go first this time, Darren. I think that is absolutely one of the biggest pressure points that is available to the international community, is the economic leverage, because I think what we've seen so far is that China has been quite happy to ignore strong representations of discontent from the US and other countries. Not fully, because it has, as we've talked about, they have changed how these look. They have shut down some of these camps. But as we are also talking about, a lot of these people are still very unfree in important ways. And there's still a large number of people who are incarcerated in various forms. But the place I think that carries a lot of potential at this point is moving it beyond government talking points and into the economic sector. So I do think that international corporations do have a role to play in making sure their supply chains are clean and making sure that they are not, directly or indirectly benefiting from forced labor or supporting the economy that is forcing in which all these people are being forced to work.
Yeah, I can add to that. One thing I should make clear is that, in case you don't know, Xinjiang is the source of around 85% of Chinese cotton, which is 20% plus of the world's supply. It's also 20+% of the world's tomatoes come from that region. And most of the labor associated with the camps have to do with garment manufacturing or cotton apparel, those sorts of things. In the region and mostly associated with the camps. Outside of the region, the Uyghur labor is in more low skilled sort of positions, and often they're in electronics, or electronics plays a larger role. So it's in particular domains of the global supply chain where camp labor or labor associated with the camp is being used. And whether or not it produces the liberation of the Uyghurs, I think as consumers, as people purchasing in bulk these goods, I think there's a moral obligation to not contribute to those kinds of labor conditions. And I think that Jessica is absolutely right that the economic cost is really, I think, what motivates the Chinese state to respond. And I think the moral cost from the camps, which will translate into an economic cost, is still just emergent, really, as more and more people understand what's happened and what is happening. I think it's been one of the worst marketing moves that China could have made in terms of having people wanting to buy their products. So I think that is really the pressure point. Can't say that it will produce liberation, but it, I think, reduces harms.
I wonder how just my own follow-up on that question, but also relates to something from the audience. I wonder how the work on identifying those supply chains accurately is going. I mean, I know it's really difficult. I remember vividly that in the late 1990s, when the Han Chinese labor activist Liu Nianchun got out of a labor camp where he'd been for years, he landed in the United States at Kennedy Airport, and the Christmas, he looked at the Christmas lights that were decorating Kennedy Airport and said, "Oh, we made those in my prison." So how is that? How advanced is that work of tracing where cotton comes from, where garments are being produced? How easy is it to do? What are the obstacles? Describe that a little bit. You first, Jessica.
Okay, we're both too polite. Yeah, I'm also not an expert on the cotton supply chain, but my understanding is that it's incredibly complicated. What happens is that cotton gets mixed up. You don't necessarily have, your one garment isn't all necessarily cotton from one place. There's been some really interesting discussions about new technologies that allow you to do, I'm not going to say DNA testing because that's not right, but some sort of isotopic or some testing on the cotton, and you can tell actually where it was grown, because it has a unique signature from where it was grown. And that would be one way of testing, even if you don't have visibility into your entire supply chain, right? There's a bunch of middlemen that you're going through. You would know ultimately if any of your cotton came from that, from Xinjiang. So that's one new tool. I don't think that's in wide use. And I think that there's still massive problems. There's just, the supply chain is incredibly opaque. Cotton goes through so many different stages of processing in a bunch of different places. And so it's not like you can just even ask who you're buying from directly where they got it, because they may not know all the steps either. And then obviously there's the issue with, you can go up and do all the inspections you want, but how do you know it's not a Potemkin sort of factory situation that you're walking into?
And the other piece of that is that the state and local officials and company of leaders are actively trying to hide their use of Uyghur labor. Um, Although it's sort of a mixed bag, because initially they were really celebrating it as a way of them showing how they're embracing the aid Xinjiang, which is how a lot of this stuff is talked about. Those economic development projects. So, having Uyghur laborers are something that people are used to celebrate, and you can still find some of those documents. And so, what I know that researchers that are looking at this are doing is they're archiving all of that as a first step, all of those available documents, and then they're working through corporate and other forms, other trade platforms where you can find some of this stuff being sent from place to place, all the way down to the cotton bale, like, because each bale has a ID number. So there is work being done. It's a lot of work, and really there could be more funding and institutional support around that kind of work.
Got a couple of questions, including one from our boss, Orville Schell, head of the Center on U.S.-China Relations, about the about the bureaucratic underpinnings of the detention camps. Is there some, which part of the government oversees them? And Orville's question is, how do they relate to the larger Laogai reform through labor system of prisons and other kinds of detention facilities in China?
Okay, well, I'll start. Jessica can correct me and fill everything else in. So it's a little bit complicated. I mean, because there's some opacities in terms of how they talk about these things and what evidence you can find. But it's very clear that the Civil Affairs Ministry, which really moves out of the Shechu, which is what it's called in Chinese, is one of the bureaucratic sort of systems or organizations that assess people to decide if they're trustworthy or not, if they should be recommended for detention. And they also go into the camps and monitor people from their neighborhoods to make sure that they're progressing, and and then they monitor them when they come out as well. So the Civil Affairs Ministry, those are civil servants. They're not police, actually, but they work in very close proximity to the police. And the Public Security Bureau and State Security, they are, I think, the main sort of organizational or bureaucratic organs that run the camps, as far as I can see from bid contracts and so on. There is, in some cases, I think, like a special commission sort of within the PSB that is in charge of the camps. But I'm kind of at the limit of my knowledge in terms of sort of the bureaucratic minutia. In general, it's PSB, Public Security Bureau, and Civil Affairs Ministry.
I'll add the Ministry of Justice, because they have, they're also the ones that technically are the bureaucratic umbrella under which prisons are run. And some of the documents talk about them helping set up camps initially. Whether I think Darren's right, it's not Ministry of Justice civil servants like in the camps necessarily, but it's underneath that umbrella as well. They have some sort of role in how this is all being done. And Darren, I learned so much from this book, but also I was like so depressed that I hadn't realized what a large role that the Ministry of Civil Affairs had. And every single place in the book where it's mentioned, I have it circled 20 times. So I'm really just grateful for that, actually, that bit of information that you made so clear to the world.
I think we have time for maybe just one or two more questions. We have a question about the response to reports of what's taking place in Xinjiang on what the audience member calls the global left, and this person says it's disappointing to hear genocide denial from some groups on the left, and I want to hear your thoughts on that. I know, Darren, you've been involved, you've been a signatory to several letters by left identifying scholars in response to some of the most egregious kind of denialism. But how do you understand why this is happening?
I don't understand it, to be honest. I think there is a reflex probably on the left to identify with China as a socialist state, which is not really, but I think, because the Communist Party is still in charge, they see it as sort of in the camp of people that they want to be allied with. And so people will bend over backwards to believe disinformation about this, the conditions on the ground. And there is a history with leftists taking the wrong side on things like this. When it came to the genocide in Cambodia, leftists, at least initially, said, "Oh, this can't be true," and there were leftists that supported the Cultural Revolution and other things. So I think this moment is similar in some ways. I think the rivalry between the U.S. and China figures in this pretty strongly, and they feel like Western media and scholars like myself are really propping up the U.S. state in some way by looking at the empirical reality that people live in Xinjiang. And so I think they feel like it's damaging to China to talk about these things. And so the only reason we could want to do that is because, we have a position in opposition to China. That's not the case necessarily at all. There may be some that have written about this that do feel in those ways. They're anti-China. But, this is a human rights crisis. It's a labor rights crisis. It's a technology crisis, it's a human crisis, and anyone of conscience should be willing to stand up in opposition to it. So that's the stance that I've taken.
All right, I've got one more, I think, question that maybe would allow you to end on a slightly hopeful note. We'll see. But the question is about what would it look like for Chinese society to recover from what is happening in Xinjiang? If China were to take a more liberal turn, the questioner asks, how could it explain this to the rest of the Han population? What kinds of resentment that these policies have generated among Uyghurs? Well, what might that look like? Is there a way that you could envision any of this ending a little less appallingly?
Well, there's no easy solutions to this, and a scholar I was talking to recently said it's sometimes you just have to sit in despair, and that's useful too, to just dwell on the moment and not think about solutions all the time, to really just sit with the pain and the suffering and see it for what it is. That's important. And I think if Han people doing that is also really crucial, coming to the truth of what's been done in their name. And there are some people that are beginning to do that, have done that. That's, I think, how you start to get to some form of reconciliation. But recovering from these sorts of situations takes a very long time, generations really, and it takes a lot of active work. And so truth and reconciliation will be something that when it comes will play out over a long period of time. I don't have an easy solution to this problem, but I am heartened to see Han people feeling a sense of obligation to take a position and to speak to their friends, to their social network about what they know to be true, what they've seen themselves, those sorts of things.
Is there a plan to translate your book into Chinese? Is that happening?
I don't know if that's happening. There's some discussion about translating it into Italian and into Thai, but yeah, it may come at some point. We'll see. Yeah, it's still new to the world, so we'll see what life it takes.
Well, I really hope that happens. It's a really incredible book, and we feel so grateful that we were able to host its launch and to have a chance to talk about it with you again. The book is in the camps. I've got my galley copy here, and it is available through Columbia University Press and elsewhere. So thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to you, Jessica, and Darren. Thank you, and we will talk to you soon. Good night.